If there's one thing we learned about lending protocols recently is that security should not be taken lightly and negligence should not exist. Now, luckily, Silo Finance, which is in the lead when it comes to lending markets on Arbitrum, has been audited quite a few times and has taken security one step forward with their lending models. And this is something that we're going to touch on right now. Sorry to interrupt you there, folks. I just want to quickly chime in and give you a quick update on our development. So contracts are still being in development, and we have been testing out the product for the past 45 days. I just released a tweet. This is what you are expecting, all right? So naked USDC and naked USDC out, and those are the annualized return over that period of 45 days. That's the range that you see in front of you. Now remember, markets are risky, markets are dynamic, but the goal here is to always optimize our strategy in order to give you the best return on just supplying USDC. That is the end game. Soft launch announcement coming in soon. So instead of having one big lending pool like the likes of Aave and Compound, they have segregated markets, tri-asset markets, so to speak, named silos, hence the name Silo Finance. And within each of these markets, you have a native asset coming in from a specific project and ETH plus USDC. So ETH USDC are the same denominator when it comes to all of these lending markets. And if you scroll down, you'll see this. You'll see the available amount of money within each market that you can borrow. Now, on the right here, you have both the deposit interest, so the lending interest, and the borrowing interest. Now, depending on your risk tolerance, you have to understand that the more money there is in a specific market, the better it is. So the more liquidity, the better it is when it comes to swaps, liquidations, so on and so forth. I mean, you know probably the risk of lending markets overall. I'm not gonna regurgitate them, but you can actually check them encyclopedia, apologies, on the risks. So all of these risks are everywhere across DeFi, and they're more so in lending markets. All right, so we're talking smart contract, we're talking liquidation, bad debt, when it comes to potentially money that doesn't exist, you know, money that lenders provided that doesn't exist anymore, meaning that's called bad debt. So people borrowed funds without having anything as collateral, so to speak, and that debt is not covered anymore. So going back to the business model here, there are so many things that can be done because of these isolated markets. So if you have skin in 3 markets and one, for example, unfortunately gets exploited, at least you're not exposed entirely. All right, so at least there's that. Like I said, this is one step further in regards to security when it comes to their lending model. Now, there are so many things you can do, but what you cannot do, however, is loop in. Looping is the act of depositing one asset, borrowing the same asset, depositing again, so on and so forth. So as long as the lending interest is higher than the borrowing interest, you should accrue interest overall when you loop in. You know, up to a certain extent, of course, otherwise you face liquidation issues if your health factor decreases below 1. So you cannot loop in within a specific lending market on Silo yet, but they have hinted that this could be possible in the second version. We're gonna touch base on the second version coming in real soon. So you can do this in so many ways. You can deposit, let's say, for example, here, WEETH. You can borrow both ETH and USDC, and you can take these 2 assets that you borrowed, deposit them somewhere else, borrow a third asset, so on and so forth. So deposit 1, borrow 2, deposit 2, borrow 1. So many ways that can be played this, as long as you understand the risks and as long as you see, you know, some stability when it comes to lending rates or borrowing rates. Like, don't, for example, YOLO in when you see that there's a small borrowing rate here, but there's not enough liquidity. So the moment you borrow funds, the interest shoots up because there isn't enough money to cover your borrowing. All right, so keep that in mind. But if you put money in and then you borrow, potentially that could, you know, offset a bit of that higher interest rate. So just, you know, be mindful that because they're not all together pulled in, you will have that risk of smaller liquidities across the board. But the cool thing about this is that because it's more concentrated, then lenders also get a nice lion's share at the end of the day. Now they do have a governance token called Silo, and Silo is doing okay from my perspective. So this is the all-time chart right here, but this is denominated in ETH. And I usually like to look at relative valuations, because if I flip to USDC or USD in this case now, you'll see that it's a much better chart in dollar terms. But remember, ETH rose up quite a bit recently, so that's a bit misleading. But still, this is the chart that usually retail traders look at, all right, or normal investors. And this chart, like I said, is much better than the ETH chart. But still, overall, it's not a bad chart. So Silo isn't highly inflationary. They do reward it sometimes within their markets, but right now there's no usage for it other than adding liquidity, for example, or I think it's also integrated in some other DeFi protocols, but that's something that you would need to check, and potentially me as well. But that's it. However, all of that will change with the upcoming V2 launch. And the V2 launch, there are quite a few updates that they are bringing in. Now, this was scheduled for April. It hasn't happened yet. I think they're having delays when it comes to audits, because like I said, security is of most importance here, and you cannot mess with these things. You want this to be solid, and you want this to be bulletproof. You don't want holes in smart contracts when there's millions involved and potentially other DeFi protocols using your lending market. That's very important. You want to please everyone, normal users and protocols. So for me, the main thing that caught my eye here, because we're not gonna go over all this thread in detail, you can do this by yourself, but they will add something called liquidity vaults, which, you know, potentially has the looping effect embedded in them, and overall an easy to use, you know, way for lenders, an easier way, so to speak, because lending is quite straightforward overall. And they are introducing vSilo, which would give you a revenue share and a reward boost, and, you know, the thing that Silo used to give, aka governance and voting power, etc. But the protocol share fee is technically the fee that the DAO takes within markets, because that's something you also have to look for. So if I click on any market, and I'm gonna scroll down to the bottom to show you how the interest is being calculated and what happens at the end, you see this right here. For example, this is what I shared. This is a small APR that you get in Silo, but it's not highly inflationary. So if you scroll down, for example, here, let's see the USDCE lending market. So when you actually come in and you deposit funds, so when you connect your wallet and you deposit funds, you will see a section where it says that there's a fee that goes to Silo. It's about 10%, I think. So this fee is actually given to the DAO, aka the Treasury, and that Treasury will start giving up some of that money for vSilo folks, which, by the way, will acquire vSilo through providing liquidity on Balancer. It's 80/20 Silo wrapped ETH. Now, this is something, like I said, that caught my eye, and hopefully these new integrations with looping potentially would bring more capital, because right now Silo is sitting at about 137 mil. If you compare this to recent lending markets like Zero Land, for example, they're still a bit lacking behind. Albeit, Silo is mainly on Ethereum and Arbitrum, whereas Zero Land, for example, is deployed on a lot of these emerging markets like Blast, Manta, Linea, to name a few. So, conclusion here, Silo Finance for me is potentially a very good lending market opportunity to leverage what they have and bring assets from their platforms across other DeFi protocols. So honestly, if I were to use lending markets today, I would use Silo if I'm on Arbitrum or Ethereum, or I would use Zero Land if I'm on emerging markets. But still, you need to ask yourself, yeah, sure, their interests are a bit higher than the likes of Aave because of everything we just discussed, but still, Aave is the benchmark of security when it comes to these things. So people will still go where it's safer for them to put their assets versus chasing, higher APRs and higher interest on others. So that's something that you have to understand. That's why big money will not really care about these fluctuations, but what they care about is that their money should be in safe hands, sitting somewhere and not be taken out the next day. All right, so that's, I think, the main thing when it comes to these, fluctuations in TVL, and that's why people with big bucks prefer security over everything else. And that's, an argument that I always make when it comes to even blockchains. Why do you think there's so much money on Ethereum? Oh yeah, sure, it's more expensive or much more expensive. It's slower, yes, 100%, but it's the securest or the safest place that you can put your money in right now, and it's potentially the most decentralized chain. We do have a Telegram community. Consider joining, link will be below. And with that, see you in the next one. Have a good one.